Good afternoon. I want to let you know that we'll be starting in approximately 3 minutes. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm doing this to test our closed captioning system. This is a test for our closed captioning system. Good afternoon. I want to remind us that we have a dial-in telephone, which is at 800-750-4065. Again, that's 1-800-750-4065. When you dial that number, you're going to need to put in a passcode. The passcode is 580-832-pound. Again, that's 580-832-pound. We'll begin momentarily. One more time, testing our closed captioning. I'm testing our closed captioning to see if closed caption words pop up. Okay, we're doing our test right now. I see you all in the chat room wondering if you should be hearing something. Hopefully you're hearing my voice now. We're testing the telephone line and then we will get started. Good afternoon. We are now ready to begin this afternoon's webinar. I want to remind you that there's a survey that should be appearing on your screen now. We'd like to know whether or not you're hearing us via the computer audio or the telephone audio. Sam, that is the nature of the survey, is it not?
No, it's to see how many people are in the room viewing the webinar.
I see. So please fill out the survey to let us know how many people are in the room viewing the webinar. That way we can have a full head count of everyone who can participate in today's webinar. As a reminder, once again, there's a telephone number, 800-750-4065. If you're joining us by telephone, the code is 580832#. Well, welcome to the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act WIFIA webinar. I am your moderator, Anthony Curcio. My company, Summit Consulting, is a contractor with the WIFIA program. We're hosting today's webinar from Summit's offices on New Jersey Avenue on a rainy and overcast Washington, D.C. day, just like it was last week. We have rain here today again. This is a live presentation, but it is being recorded. We have designed this webinar to be accessible to those with physical disabilities. If you have recommendations to us about how to make this presentation more accessible, please let us know. We'll show you later how to contact us. We want to thank our provider, Adobe Connect, for making the technology of this webinar possible. I'll quickly review how webinars work. You will see our slides. Your host here in Washington, D.C. will control the slides. You won't be able to do that. You will hear the voice of the speakers and see a live closed captioned transcript, but you will not see the faces of the speakers because we're not using video today. Your audio should be coming through the computer speakers if you're using computer audio, or on the telephone if you've decided to use our call-in telephone line, whichever you've chosen. If for some reason you can't hear my voice right now, but you're reading this on closed caption, then please adjust the volume on your computer or try to use the call-in line. You should be able to hear my voice. The closed captions I'm referencing should be on the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You will have a chance to pose written questions, but you will not have the ability to speak or ask those questions verbally. We're going to tell you a little bit later, we're going to tell you more about how to pose questions. Recently, earlier in November and October, the WIFIA program led a 6-city outreach tour. We want you to know that the content of this webinar, the webinar last week, and the webinar that we're having next week closely follow the content that we used on that 6-city outreach tour. If you attended one of those outreach sessions, the material that you're going to hear today, just like the materials from last week's webinar and next week's webinar, is largely identical to the outreach material. Well, let's get started. I've just flipped the slide, and what you should be seeing now talks about the purpose. Why are we having this webinar? What is the purpose of these 3 webinars, and what was the purpose of our outreach sessions? The purpose is to foster a greater understanding of the requirements of the WIFIA program. We think that to be a successful applicant and to be successfully selected for the WIFIA program, you first need to begin with a strong understanding of the purpose of the program. We want you to understand how the program works, what its purposes are, and when you understand that, you will be in a much better position to submit a letter of interest, and then if selected, to submit a successful application. We think we need to do more than just simply explain how to apply. We need to explain the purposes of the program. So that is the purpose of our outreach effort and these 3 webinars. This is part of a continuing information program that we here at WIFIA are sponsoring. You'll see here that today's webinar, December 6th, is one of 3. We had one last week. We'll have one next week. Of course, this follows that 6-city outreach tour that I talked about. Please mark your calendar for next week's webinar if you want to attend. You may also find information at our website here on this slide, which is epa.gov/WIFIA. Eventually, we will post the content from these webinars and the 6-city outreach on our website so that you can refer to it and share it with others who may have an interest. If you want to contact us, there is our website again and email. If you want to receive regular updates about progress at the WIFIA program, there is a link there that will provide you with regular updates about the WIFIA program. Well, today's speakers include myself there. I'm the moderator. You'll hear from me again during our question time. But we're hosting today Karen Fligger from the US EPA. She'll be speaking first, followed by Danusha Chandy, who will be speaking also from the EPA. If you haven't picked it up already, we really welcome your questions. We think that your questions are not only helpful to answer your question, but they're also helpful to others who may not have thought of your question. So we are developing a frequently asked questions list. As we receive questions from you that we haven't heard before, we will add them to that list, to that frequently asked questions, and ultimately will be posted to our website. But today, for questions, let me be extra clear. At the conclusion of the prepared material in today's webinar, we will engage in a question and answer session. For those of you that participated last week, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. In the lower right-hand window of your screen, there is a box that says Q&A. There should be anyway. And it says Q&A in the small margin above that box. You may type a question at any time. Those questions, as they are typed and submitted, will go into a list of questions that build up throughout the presentation. At the end of that presentation, we will select the questions and answer them. We cannot guarantee that every question will be answered. Some questions will be combined that are similar, but we will do our very best to answer all the questions that we can in the question and answer session when our speakers have completed. Well, at this point, I think all of the introductory comments are complete, and I'd like to welcome and introduce Ms. Karen Fligger from the EPA.
Thank you, Anthony. So today I'm going to talk about the application process, but before I do that, I just want to take a moment to do a quick announcement. I'm very excited to announce that Administrator McCarthy signed 2 rules today to establish the administrative structure necessary to offer credit assistance under the WIFIA program. As many of you know, over the past 2 years, EPA has focused on setting up the administrative structure necessary to launch WIFIA. So this is a really big milestone for us, and we're really excited that our administrator signed those rules today. The 2 rules are the interim final WIFIA implementation rule, which outlines the WIFIA program's administrative framework, including the eligibility requirements, application process, project priorities, and federal requirements for borrowers. It also explains the criteria EPA will use to select among project applicants, as well as EPA's key priorities in this program. In addition, she signed the proposed fee rule. EPA is proposing fees to reimburse the agency for the cost of retaining expert firms, including financial, engineering, and legal advisory services that are needed to administer the program effectively. Congress provided for these fees when it enacted WIFIA, and this rule will ensure that the program can run sustainably. We are in the process currently of updating our website to include the language of these rules. Both rules will be published in the Federal Register. That will be the official publication. The versions that we have on our website are the pre-publication versions, but it will be posted on regulations.gov in the next week or so, and they will be open for public comment. So now I'll move on to what we planned on talking about today. So we're going to talk about the application process, and I'm going to start today's presentation with a general overview of the entire application process. We've divided into 3 steps: project selection, project approval, and negotiation and closing. During this webinar and the one scheduled for next Monday, December 12th, we will go over these in detail, but I'm going to provide a brief overview now to kick this off. In addition, in each section, as we go into detail, we'll talk a little bit more about the estimated timelines. And for the project selection timeline, it will be relatively fixed and predictable, and then the timeline will vary considerably from project to project for the second 2 phases. So project selection is the competitive portion of the process. This is where EPA will announce available funding, and prospective borrowers will submit letters of interest for selection for a loan. EPA will evaluate those letters of interest and invite selected prospective borrowers that it intends to fund to submit an application. So project selection is the part that we're going to focus on today for the remainder of this webinar. Project approval is the application phase. At this phase, prospective borrowers who have been invited to apply will submit an application, and EPA will review that application and develop, through negotiation with the prospective borrower, a term sheet. Project approval culminates with the signing of the term sheet by EPA's administrator. And then the final phase is negotiation and closing. And this is where the WIFIA program finalizes the terms of the credit assistance to the prospective borrower based on the term sheet. At closing, the administrator and the prospective borrower execute the credit agreement, and the credit agreement is the binding legal document that allows the borrower to receive WIFIA funds. So the project approval, negotiation, and closing phases will be talked about in a lot more detail during our next webinar. So under the Paperwork Reduction Act, all forms need to be approved by OMB prior to their use. And as a result, the WIFIA application materials, including the letter of interest and the application, were put out for public comment twice, and they're available on regulations.gov. So at this point, those application materials are still draft, and they will require OMB approval before they are finalized. So we are waiting for comment and approval from OMB, and once they're approved, we will announce their approval in the Federal Register, and in addition, we'll post them on EPA's WIFIA website. So for the remainder of this webinar, we're going to walk through the project selection in a lot more detail. So for project selection, there are 4 steps. The first step is the notice of funding availability, and this announces our appropriation and the parameters of the competition process. The next step is the letter of interest submission. At this step, prospective borrowers complete a letter of interest and submit it to EPA for review. We expect that we'll open a 90-day window for submission during the first round, and then after that, we'll evaluate letters approximately every 6 months. So for example, if we opened a round in January, we would close it at the end of March, and then everything that we received by that deadline, March 31st, would be evaluated in round 1. After that, prospective borrowers would have to wait until the next open period to submit. And that next open period's deadline would be about 6 months later. The next phase is the letter of interest evaluation, and this is where a technical review team of EPA staff reviews the letters of interest and evaluates them against the eligibility criteria, determines their credit worthiness, and does an engineering technical feasibility review and looks at them based on the selection criteria. So EPA anticipates that this review will take 1 to 2 months. And then finally, project selection. This is where a selection committee composed of senior managers from EPA's Office of Water will select the projects that are invited to apply. So a project could be eligible but not be selected to apply. EPA will only invite prospective borrowers that it intends to fund to submit a full application. So we anticipate that this process will take another month or 2. So as I said before, project selection is a competitive process where we identify the projects to apply which are eligible, creditworthy, technically feasible, and meet the public policy goals that are outlined in the WIFIA statute and regulation. So the first stage, the notice of funding availability. A notice of funding availability is an announcement in the Federal Register for each new appropriation. When WIFIA receives an appropriation, we will issue a notice of funding availability. It will be in the Federal Register, but we will also be announcing it quite broadly. So look to our website, Facebook, Twitter, and also announcements from partner organizations. We want to make sure that we reach as many people as possible to let them know we have funding available. The notice of funding availability will provide information about the following. It will tell you the amount of funding to support WIFIA credit assistance, both the appropriated subsidy amount and how much we anticipate that we'll be able to lend with that amount. EPA's priorities for the appropriation. If you were with us last week, we mentioned the priorities that we intend to be in the first notice of funding availability. Those priorities were adaptation to extreme weather and climate change, enhanced energy efficiency, green infrastructure, and repair, rehabilitation, and replacement of pipes and plants. We'll also talk about the weight given to each selection criteria. And later in today's webinar, my colleague Danusha Chandy will walk through the selection criteria and their weights. You'll learn more about that today as well. And we'll also talk about the deadlines for submitting the letters of interest. So you'll find out what the deadline is, and you may also find out if we're going to have more than one round with a given appropriation, what future deadlines would be also. Next, I'll talk about the letter of interest submission. This is where prospective borrowers tell us about the projects that they want funded, and I'm going to walk through the different sections of the letter of interest. So again, prospective borrowers, we're asking you to provide the WIFIA program with enough information to validate the eligibility of the prospective borrower and the proposed project, to perform a preliminary creditworthiness assessment, to perform a preliminary engineering feasibility analysis, and to supply the WIFIA program with information to evaluate the project against the selection criteria as they're defined in the NOFA and the statute and the rule. So the WIFIA program website will have information on the letter of interest. They'll have the letter of interest form as well as a handbook to help you in filling out the letter of interest. Our intent is to collect information that you already have about your project. That said, I want to give you some tips of what we're thinking. The more information, the better. So give us what you have about your project. However, you should not create new documents just for the purpose of WIFIA. Preliminary documents are acceptable, and in places where written responses are asked for, you can refer us to publications, studies, attachments, documents that are already in place, and point us to the information in those documents rather than rewriting descriptions of answers to those specific questions. So what I'm trying to say is it's fine to say in response to a question, please see document X pages, X through X. We know we are asking for quite a bit of information, but we think it's information that you should already have if you're planning a project. And we want to just point to information you already have rather than having you rewrite a lot of information. All right, so the first section is prospective borrower information. And the purpose of this section is to provide EPA specific information to understand who the borrower is and some general information about its project. So that basic information includes your taxpayer ID, the DUNS number, contact information, what kind of entity you are in terms of the eligible entities. So are you a corporation, a partnership, a joint venture, a trust, a government agency, a tribal government, a state infrastructure finance authority, or some combination of the above. We also want you to provide an organizational chart that includes the members and the titles of the project team or the different entities involved in the project. As we talked about in the last webinar, if a private organization is submitting a project to WIFIA, they must demonstrate project sponsorship. If the entity is not a state or local government, a tribal government, or an agency of a state or local government, you must provide evidence of public sponsorship. And this could be a lot of different things. It could be a letter. It could be some sort of memorandum of understanding or resolution. But ultimately, we want to make sure that the government in the area where you're proposing the project is on board with that project and informed about it. In addition, we will ask you a question about readiness to proceed. It's a yes/no answer where we're asking you to confirm that you would be able to submit an application within 1 year of your invitation. So section B is the project plan. And this section shifts the focus from the prospective borrower to giving us information about the project that's being proposed. So the project description should explain what the project is for, who it is serving, and why it is necessary. So in this section, we ask for basic project information, so the location, the population served, the purpose, the basic design features, the estimated capital costs, and the schedule. We also ask you for the project delivery method. So we want to know if it's design build, construction manager at risk, design bid build. And that just helps us understand what kinds of documents we should be looking for. We also want the project purpose, and this should really explain the public benefits of the project. A strong description in this area will detail quantitatively what the need for the project is and the potential impact of the project. Basically, here we want you to demonstrate how the project fits into EPA's mission and the WIFIA program priorities. The preliminary analysis asks you for engineering reports that you've done for the project. So we want you to give you any analysis that has been done to date. So that could include feasibility studies or preliminary designs. And this helps us to understand how much planning has already been done and what are the results of that planning. And of course, these can be sent to us as attachments to your letter of interest. We want you to provide an alternatives analysis that demonstrates that the project proposed is the most efficient and beneficial way to achieve the results that you're looking for. So for example, you might talk about how the project offers the lowest capital cost, the greatest ease of operation, or the fewest environmental impacts. If you have a formal alternatives analysis, we want you to include it. If there's no formal document, we're still going to ask you to tell us in a narrative why the proposed project is the best alternative. And finally, authorizing actions. So basically, especially for systems or corporate credits, we want you to describe any sort of action that would be required to enable you to enter into a credit agreement with WIFIA. So that could be board approvals or a legislative action. And again, we want this to understand the timeline and any potential hurdles there might be for the project to proceed. In addition, in section B for the project plan, we want you to provide a system master plan if that's something you have available. We want to understand how the project fits into your overall system. We also want you to tell us the status of environmental reviews. So we want to know what you're required to do for environmental reviews, where you are in that process, and what you expect the timeline to be. Similarly, for permitting, we want to know your plan for achieving all required permits and approvals. If your project is serving a small community, and for WIFIA, a small community is 25,000 individuals, we want you to tell us more details about that small community and provide any data that supports the community size. Qualifying as a small community project means that your total project cost is allowed to be smaller, so it can be less than $5 million. And then finally, community outreach. We want you to tell us what kind of community outreach you've done, what you've conducted to date, and any future plans that you have. So the next section of the letter of interest is the project operations and maintenance plan. There is a statutory requirement for us to look at your operation maintenance plan and for you to have it in place at closing. So at this point in the letter of interest, we want to start getting that information from you. So it can be a preliminary plan, but we want to understand how you're going to ensure that our investment is protected. So in the plan, you should include the estimated economic useful life of the project, a description of the key operation and maintenance activities, how much you think they'll cost, how they will be funded, and the estimated costs and funding sources over time. The next section of the letter of interest is the financing plan. I'm going to briefly walk through the information that we will request in Section D, the financing plan, in the letter of interest. The questions in this section are designed to provide EPA with the prospective borrower's proposed plan for financing its projects and additional information to assess the project's creditworthiness. During our next webinar, we will again talk about many of these items in a lot more detail as part of the description of the application process. So just to start some of the things in this section, we're going to ask for a written overview of the proposed financial structure of the project. We're going to ask you to describe the financial condition, so your current financial condition, and this has 3 parts. So a brief discussion of the prospective borrower's current level of leverage and an explanation of any risks of imminent default, technical default, or difficulty in meeting debt service. Systems may want to mention their post-retirement or pension benefits as part of this. We'd also want a description of your experience in undertaking similar types of projects. And we also want audited financials if they're available. In addition, we want you to provide us the estimated capital cost of the project, including which costs are eligible and which are ineligible, and provide us a sources and uses of funds statement. For each source of funding, we want you to identify the amount, the disbursement timing, the lien priority, the repayment profile, credit enhancements, and any other security features. We also want you to identify the dedicated revenue source that's going to be pledged as the repayment of the WIFIA credit instrument, and some supporting detail about that pledge, so your legal authority to pledge it, the historic track record, the projected performance or a demonstration of a sufficiency to meet the project's obligations, and the resiliency risk exposure of that revenue source. We'd also will also ask you to explain the flow of funds, showing payment priorities associated with pledged revenues. In addition, in the financing plan, we want you to describe to us the existing indebtedness and the quantity of existing claims and future claims on the revenue source. That would include the amounts of those claims, the origination date, interest rates, amortization schedule, and final maturity. We also need to know about any future permitted claims on the revenue source. In addition, we will ask for a description of how the senior obligation will garner an investment grade rating, any key rating considerations, the strengths and weaknesses of the credit, and the anticipated debt service metrics during the repayment period. Finally, we will ask you to provide a financial pro forma that explains the key assumptions, project construction funding, cash flow performance through final maturity, and calculation of debt service coverage during the repayment period. EPA will provide a sample of the type of financial pro forma that they would like to see from prospective borrowers on their website once they announce funding availability. And then any additional information that you want to provide us. And then finally, we will ask you whether or not you've already consulted with your state revolving loan authority. And if so, what was the result of that conversation? I will explain later that we do have a statutory requirement to consult with the State Revolving Fund Program. However, we also ask this question because we think it's helpful for us to know whether you have already considered SRF funding as an option. The next section is the selection criteria. In this section, EPA asks prospective borrowers to describe how the proposed project achieves the public policy benefits outlined in the WIFIA statute, regulation, and notice of funding availability. So this is really your opportunity to make your case to us and tell us how your project meets our policy goals. So I'm going to walk through them right now. The first 11 are in the statute, and the additional 2 were written by EPA and included in the regulation that was signed today. Your project will be scored on each of these selection criterion. In your responses, you should provide a description of your response and reference any supporting documentation when possible. And as I said, I'm going to walk through them right now, but later in this presentation, Danusha will go into a lot more detail about each of them. The first selection criterion is the extent to which the project is nationally or regionally significant with respect to the generation of economic and public health benefits. The second criterion is the extent to which the project financing plan includes public or private financing in addition to the WIFIA loan. The third one is the likelihood that the WIFIA loan would enable the project to proceed at an earlier date than the project would otherwise be able to proceed. And fourth, the extent to which the project uses new or innovative approaches, and those include energy efficient parts and systems, renewable or alternative sources of energy, green infrastructure, the development of alternative sources of drinking water through desalination, aquifer recharge, and water recycling. Criteria 5 is the extent to which the project protects against extreme weather events, including floods and hurricanes, as well as the impacts of climate change. 6 is the extent to which the project helps maintain or protect the environment or public health. 7 is the extent to which a project serves regions with significant energy exploration, development, or production areas. 8 is the extent to which the project serves regions with significant water resources challenges. And those water resources challenges are pretty broad, so that includes water quality concerns, water quantity concerns, groundwater, surface water, or other in relation to groundwater, surface water, or other resources, significant flood risk, other challenges as they're outlined in existing regional, state, or multi-state agreements, and the protection of water resources with exceptional recreational value or ecological importance. Number 9 is the extent to which the project addresses identified municipal, state, or regional priorities. Criterion 10 is the readiness of the project to proceed towards development. Criterion 11 is the extent to which the WIFIA loan reduces the contribution of federal assistance to the project. And criteria 12 and 13 are the 2 that EPA added. 12 is the extent to which the project addresses the need for repair, rehabilitation, or replacement of treatment works, community water systems, or aging water or water distribution or wastewater collection systems. And 13 is the extent to which the project serves economically stressed communities or pockets of economically stressed ratepayers and otherwise non-economically stressed communities. The next section, Section F, is just a basic collection of the contact information that we need to know about the prospective borrower. Section G is a certification section. In Section G requires that the borrower certify that they understand that WIFIA funding requires compliance with federal statutes and regulations. And this includes the American Iron and Steel provisions, Davis-Bacon, the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. It also restricts the use of federal funding for lobbying. In addition, prospective borrowers are required to certify that from a financial point of view, you're in good standing with the government. So for example, that you have not been debarred, you're not delinquent on any existing debt, or have been indicted. In addition, you're asked to confirm that you're an authorized representative of the prospective borrower. So basically, this section is a list of certifications, and there will be required to be a signature to confirm all of these. Section 8 outlines our intended process to notify the State Revolving Loan Fund Program. By statute, EPA is required to notify the appropriate State Infrastructure Financing Authority or State Revolving Loan Fund Program when it receives an application for SRF eligible projects. We think it's really important to have strong coordination with our SRF programs. So to allow better coordination with the SRF programs, EPA will share letters of interest, which is sort of the first phase, with the appropriate SRF program within 30 days of receiving that letter of interest. So as part of the letter of interest process, prospective borrowers must acknowledge this, and they can either agree to have their entire letter of interest, including any supporting materials, shared with the SRF program, or to opt out of sharing of those materials. If the prospective borrower opts out of having their full set of materials shared, EPA will still notify the SRF of the prospective borrower's letter of interest. So moving on to the next phase, which is the letter of interest evaluation. As we receive letters of interest, we will initiate the evaluation process. The evaluation process has kind of 4 parts: the eligibility screening, a preliminary creditworthiness assessment, a preliminary engineering feasibility analysis, and selection criteria scoring. The eligibility screening is pretty straightforward, and the goal is to ensure that the prospective borrower is an eligible entity, that the project is an eligible project type, that the project costs are no more than 49% of total eligible costs, and to make sure that you sign the certification box and understand the compliance requirements that come with federal funding. The preliminary creditworthiness assessment is to evaluate the reasonable assurance of repayment by the prospective borrower. Projects that are not found to be creditworthy will not move forward in the process. In addition, the evaluation will estimate the amount of budget authority necessary to fund the WIFIA loan. The WIFIA appropriation is used to cover the reserve subsidy required for each project. And that reserve subsidy varies from project by project based on the risk profile of the project. So for each loan, we will estimate how much of our budget authority will be used for this specific project based on the risk associated with it. In general, projects will be assessed on financial strength, business and economic considerations, management, as well as other loan-specific factors. And again, next week's webinar will talk about this in a lot more detail. In addition, The preliminary engineering feasibility analysis will be an evaluation of the proposed project's design, operating, and engineering plans to verify appropriate project technology, technical feasibility based on detailed engineering information, that the operation and maintenance plan that was submitted is reasonable for the full length of the proposed project, and they will review to make sure that EPA is protected from completion risk. At this point, I'm going to hand the microphone to my colleague Danusha Chandy, who will discuss the selection criteria scoring. But before I do that, I just want to remind everyone to continue to write your questions in the Q&A box. We are gathering the questions that have already been submitted in anticipation of the Q&A period at the end of this webinar.
So far, we have almost 20 questions.
Thanks, Karen. I'm going to cover how we plan on scoring letters of interest against the selection criteria. Again, your response to the selection criteria is your way of making your best case for project selection, and these guidance terms are meant to help you understand how to frame your answers. So the scoring methodology is pretty simple. Each project will be scored against each criteria on a rating scale from 1 to 5, and the criteria have been weighted in accordance with EPA's mission and priorities. Here are the weights we expect to use for the first selection round. The criteria that align with our core mission have been given a higher weight of 10. Also, many of the lower weighted criteria include project components and evaluations that are covered in the engineering and credit analysis. As Karen mentioned earlier, the first 11 criteria come directly from the WIFIA statute, and the last 2 criteria were added by EPA. Now I'm going to go into the specific guidance for each of the criteria. First, I'll cover useful definitions and some boundary conditions to keep in mind, and then I'll cover what the scores will generally be based on. The first criterion is about how the project benefits national or regional public health and economic conditions. So we'll be looking for economic benefits like new jobs or impacts to industries. Public health benefits can include improving water quality and protecting source water, among others. And for purposes of this selection criteria scoring, we will consider a region to be a service area, portions of a municipality, multiple neighboring communities, a state, or multiple states. You get to define what a region is. For a project to demonstrate national impact, you can show how a project can benefit regions that are not directly served by the project. Also, keep in mind that a project that includes the consolidation or regionalization of systems can be considered to have both economic and public health benefits. If a project ends up having a net negative impact on either economic or public health conditions, it will not end up moving forward in the selection process. When we score projects, we will look at the depth of the impacts and whether they are regional or national. A project that shows national economic and public health benefits would score very highly. The second criterion looks at the effects of WIFIA funding on the project schedule. When you're responding to this criteria, you can show us how getting WIFIA funding would affect the implementation schedule for the proposed project, or you can show us that by getting WIFIA funding for one project, you will be able to implement other high priority projects sooner than anticipated. It is possible that WIFIA funding could delay a project because of the need to incorporate federal cross-cutters or other program requirements, and that this can be noted as well, that won't be a deal breaker. When we score this criterion, we'll look at the effects of funding on the proposed project schedule and, if applicable, on other projects within the system. We'll look at whether WIFIA funding helps speed up implementation of projects and whether or not a project could move forward without WIFIA funding. The third criterion looks at whether the project employs any new or innovative approaches like using energy efficient systems, use of renewable resources, green infrastructure components, desalination, and direct and indirect water reuse. New or innovative approaches can also include the distribution systems for recycled water, developing biosolids, and addressing emerging contaminants. Also, a novel application of an existing technology or method can be considered a new or innovative approach. When we score this criterion, we'll weigh how innovative the project is by looking at whether the approach has been pilot tested or implemented at full-scale levels before. A project that consists of a technology or approach that has the potential to significantly improve standard operations within the industry will get the highest score. Criterion 4 is about how the project helps protect a facility, system, or community against extreme weather events and the impacts of climate change. Extreme weather impacts can include drought, water quality degradation, floods, ecosystem changes, and changes in service demand. Project elements that can build resiliency include mitigation planning, risk assessments, flood protection, backup power, water recycling, and improving the resiliency of a system or asset. For scoring, we'll look at whether projects address extreme weather events that are happening now or have happened in the past, or whether projects are addressing long-term impacts. For example, a project that addresses a 500-year flood will score higher than a project that addresses a 100-year flood. All projects that receive WIFIA funding will have to meet federal floodplain standards, so we encourage you to show us how the project will do that when responding to this criterion as well. The fifth criterion deals with how the project helps maintain the environment or public health. So we are looking for how the project addresses the requirements of the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and other environmental laws and regulations. If a project has a net negative impact on the environment or public health, we won't move this project forward in the selection process. We will consider whether existing conditions meet regulatory requirements now, and if, without implementing the project, these conditions could deteriorate. We expect a lot of proactive repair and rehab projects to fall into this category. We'll also consider, while scoring, if a project could significantly improve the public health or environment, even if it's not expected that these conditions will fall below regulatory requirements. And a project that is necessary to bring conditions up to regulatory standards will probably score the highest for this criterion. The sixth criterion looks at whether the project serves a population within a region with energy exploration, development, or production. As I mentioned earlier, a region can be a service area, portions of a municipality, multiple neighboring communities, a state, or multiple states. We will simply score this project on whether it does or doesn't serve a population in a region with a significant energy presence. The seventh criterion addresses how the project serves regions with water resource challenges. Water resource challenges can include water quality concerns of regional, national, or international significance, water quality concerns, significant flood risk, water resources with exceptional recreational value or ecological importance, and challenges identified in existing regional, state, or multi-state agreements. And if there are other water resource challenges that you're dealing with, you can feel free to explain what those are when you answer this criterion. They don't have to exactly match what's in the guidance. Again, we will consider a region to be a service area, portions of a municipality, multiple neighboring communities, a state, or multiple states for this criterion. We have some definitions here to help people identify whether a water resource challenge is of exceptional recreational value or ecological importance when you're answering this criterion. So when you respond to this question, we encourage you to show how the proposed project addresses a water resource challenge, and if possible, how much of the challenge is expected to be alleviated by the project. We will also look at how the water resource challenge affects their ability to serve customers, maintain or improve service levels, and/or poses a significant risk to human health or life. This criterion will also be scored based on the percentage of the total project cost that addresses the water resource challenge. The eighth criterion deals with the extent to which the project addresses identified municipal, state, or regional priorities. We will simply score this project on whether the project is shown to be a priority or not. To do this, we encourage you to provide us the documentation of where it is shown to be a priority, like in a master plan or a political mandate. CIPs by themselves are not considered a prioritized list of projects unless you can also provide us supporting information that details the prioritization process. Criterion 9 looks at whether the project will be ready to begin the contracting process for construction 90 days after a loan is obligated. It's important to note that we're evaluating the readiness to begin the contracting process and not the actual construction process here. So how this is applied to each project can depend on the type of contracting process that's used, whether it's a traditional design, bid, build, or an alternative project delivery method like design build. EPA will review the projected development schedule for specifications and bid documents for traditional project delivery methods, and the proposed schedule for procurement documents such as requests for qualifications and proposals for alternative project delivery methods. When we're scoring this criterion, we'll look for where in the project schedule the project is during the letter of interest stage. We'll look at whether there are issues such as permitting or public support that may affect the schedule and could possibly delay the project. A project will score highly if it looks like the project is ready to begin the contracting process soon and doesn't have any issues that could prolong the projected development schedule. Criterion 10 looks at whether the project has identified the remaining financing in addition to the WIFIA funds. Keep in mind that we will be evaluating the project's creditworthiness separately. So a project will score high on this criterion if the remaining financing has been identified. Criterion 11 looks at whether WIFIA funding would reduce federal assistance to the project. So we don't actually expect many projects where this will be the case because most water infrastructure projects are funded without federal dollars. However, if a project can show that WIFIA funding will reduce the total federal contribution, it will score highly. The 12th criterion deals with how much the project addresses the repair, rehab, and replacement needs of a system. EPA added this criterion because addressing these needs is an agency priority. We will score this criterion based on the percentage of the total project cost that addresses repair, rehab, and replacement. Prospective borrowers are encouraged to document the system need when addressing this as well. And the last criterion deals with whether the project serves economically stressed communities. EPA added this criterion to address the needs of economically stressed communities where access to financing for critical infrastructure is often lacking or difficult to obtain. Economically stressed communities can also include groups of individuals who could benefit from a public water or sewer system but do not have the economic means to create a system on their own. When answering the criterion, you can include economic indicators like median household income, personal income per capita, or specific local affordability criteria that your system already uses. A project will score highly on this criterion if a large part of the population served by the project is considered economically stressed. And now I'll hand it back to Karen to wrap up.
Thank you, Danusha. So the final piece of the project selection is the actual project selection. So at this point, the WIFIA program staff will take information from the engineering review, the financial review, and the selection criteria review and compile it into a summary for each project. And that summary will be provided to the selection committee, which consists of senior EPA managers from the Office of Water. So the selection committee will select prospective borrowers to invite to apply. It's a 3-person committee, and there'll be a senior manager represented from each the Office of Wastewater Management, the Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water, and the Office of Water. The selection committee will consider the selection score that the technical review team put together, the preliminary engineering feasibility results, and the amount of budget authority necessary to provide the WIFIA loan. Consideration of this amount of budget authority is required by statute, and that calculation represents the risk from a financial perspective of the project. The selection committee may also consider diversity of project types and diversity of geography within the portfolio. So the goal would be to maintain a diverse portfolio, and for the WIFIA program as a new program to gain experience with different types of projects from both a technical and a financial perspective. So the projects that are selected will receive an invitation to apply. That invitation will be a written notification inviting the prospective borrower to submit an application, and that will come from the WIFIA program director. When EPA issues a written notification and invitation to apply, this indicates that we intend to fund the project, and we intend for that project to go to closing. At this point, prospective borrowers will be working specifically with a member of the WIFIA team as a primary point of contact, and only prospective borrowers who are invited to apply may send us an application form. EPA will not review applications from anyone else. Applications are required to be submitted within 1 year. However, we expect them to come to us earlier. The amount of time that it takes a prospective borrower to submit their application will have a significant impact on the overall timeline to receiving funds. The application materials will be available on the EPA website, and as I said earlier, both the application materials and the letter of interest in draft form are available on regulations.gov. Prospective borrowers, we will ask prospective borrowers to confirm that they've received their notification and to tell us whether or not they intend to apply. We would like folks that if a prospective borrower has decided that they are no longer interested in WIFIA funding, we would like you to tell us that so that we can invite other borrowers to apply. And prospective borrowers who are not invited to apply must resubmit their letters of interest to be considered for future rounds. EPA will, once these decisions are made, EPA will post the names of prospective borrowers who are invited to apply on its website. So at this point, we will move to the Q&A session. I think that a lot of questions have come in during the course of our presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to our moderator to help us through that process. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Myself, Danusha, Karen, and Sam are gathering because we will all be answering the questions potentially together. Sam, how many questions did we get in approximately?
We've received about 35 to 40 questions so far, so it's a good number.
Great. How about we get our first question teed up?
Sure. We've received a lot of requests for the presentation slides and for this session and the previous session, as well as a recording of the session, which is currently being recorded. Do we know when that will be made available to participants and on the website?
Thanks, Sam. So our intent is to get the presentation, so the PowerPoint slides, up as soon as possible, hopefully by the end of this week for the first session and the second session. We're still working on making sure the videos are loaded onto our website in a way that everyone can view them, so I'm not going to make as many promises there, but I will promise to get the presentations up on our website by the end of this week.
Great. Sam, next question.
We received a question about the application fees. I think that relates to the fee rule. Has the application fee been decided?
So as I mentioned earlier, today EPA published a proposed fee rule. So that proposed rule has proposed fees. So they're not final. We will be taking public comment, and following public comment, we will finalize that rule. The proposal has a bunch of different kinds of fees. I think the two fees that are most relevant to the application process is the application fee and the credit processing fee. We went over the overview of the process today, and I think one of the key things I want to point out is today what we talked about was the letter of interest. At the letter of interest phase, there are no fees. EPA will not charge any fees at this point. When we talk about at the next webinar, we will talk about application, and the application is only for folks who have been invited to apply because their project was selected, and that's when the fees will come in. And at that point, EPA has already signaled their intention to fund the project and bring it to closing. The fees are, the proposed fees in the fee rule are, the application fee proposed is $100,000 for large communities. So that's anything over 25,000 people, and $25,000 for small communities. So communities that are 25,000 people or less. The credit processing fee is a fee that is due at closing. That fee covers the cost of EPA hiring expert services in legal, engineering, and financial. And so that's a reimbursement of how much EPA spends on those things to bring your project to closing. We estimate that that total cost will be somewhere between $407,000 and $700,000, and that your application fee will be credited to that. But those fees vary considerably depending on the size, the complexity of the project, the amount of negotiation that you want to have with EPA. And it's not really scalable. So it's not, because you have a small project, it's not going to be less versus a large project. So it really is a lot about the negotiation and then also the technical aspects, how complex the project is. But as I said earlier, also about the fee rule, and both the fee rule, the implementation rule will be out for public comment once they're posted in the Federal Register. So if you have thoughts on either of those, please feel free to submit public comment.
Sam, next question.
We have a follow-up question to that. So we have a question that states that the level of effort required for the letter of interest seems fairly substantial. Does EPA have an estimate of the cost to someone submitting a letter of interest?
Yeah, so I mean, we did do, as part of the information collection request process, we did estimate a burden for both applicants and the agency in addition to just the fees. I apologize, I don't have those numbers at the tips of my fingers. I think we estimated something like 40 or 50 hours for completing the letter of interest, and that was based on the fact that we felt like in talking to prospective borrowers, that this information is stuff that they already have, and they're just the burden to submit the letter of interest to the WIFIA program is really in gathering all that information. It's not in generating those documents, because those documents would need to be generated for any type of project of the scale that we are talking about.
Thank you, Sam. Next question.
We have some questions about the selection criteria. So will design build projects have an inherent readiness to proceed advantage for selection over a more conventional design and then build project?
No, so it won't. We're going to look at what kind of project you're proposing, and what I meant to do with the guidance was to show you how we'd evaluate different types of projects based on what contracting process you'd be using. So whether or not you're a design build won't make a difference in your score. It'll just change how we look at your schedule and what documents we're looking for at completion when we're closing the loan. What we're trying to do is, by the time the loan is closed, we want to make sure that for a traditional project, you'll have the plans and specifications in final form so that you can begin the contracting process, putting the plans and specs out for bid within 90 days of obligation. And for a design build type project or an alternative project delivery method, we'll want to see that you'll be able to put out the procurement documents, the RFP and RFQs, within 90 days of obligation. And that's what we're really evaluating at the readiness to proceed criteria.
All right, as another selection scoring question, does a higher percent set aside for rehab mean a higher selection score?
So for criterion 12, which is the repair, rehabilitation, and repair, rehabilitation, and I forgot what the third R is. But anyway, for that criteria, for that criterion, if the more of your project that goes towards repair and rehab, the higher your score will be for that criterion.
And finally, is there a definition or guidance of what constitutes an economically stressed community?
Yeah, and when you guys see the presentation, you'll see the actual notes that go along with it. We mentioned a couple of economic data indicators you could use, like median income and per capita income, but you can also use any kind of local affordability criteria that you've developed for your own system. And I think we mentioned that there's a program handbook that will go along with our program, and there will be additional guidance on how to fill out the selection criteria with either the handbook or on our website.
Thank you, Danusha. For projects eligible but not selected for funding in a given selection round, do they need to resubmit their materials for that round, or can they simply express their interest in the subsequent round?
At this point, we're going to ask people, prospective borrowers, to resubmit for future rounds. I think that's something that we will be looking at as we go through multiple rounds to figure out what is the best process. But right now, we will ask prospective borrowers to resubmit for future rounds.
If the WIFIA program and an SRF program are partners in a project, is the SRF program allowed to disperse all of its funds before the WIFIA begins disbursements?
Yes. Yes.
Other than for communities that may have difficulty obtaining financing, what benefits does the WIFIA program have over, for example, a clean water SRF?
So I think we see the SRF programs, both the drinking water and clean water SRF, as sort of partners. I think what we want to do is figure out how we all play in the field of infrastructure financing. I think for some states, SRF availability is limited, and so large projects have difficulty getting loans or have to break up their projects over a longer period of time. So WIFIA funding may allow them to get a much larger loan in a single amount and move forward more quickly with that project. I think there's also some additional flexibilities that the WIFIA program may have that the SRF program doesn't have in terms of loan length. I know having the WIFIA loan can go out 35 years. SRF loans, it varies from state to state between 20 and 30 years. I think anything else?
Yes, answering the question almost in the negative. I think WIFIA understands that many applicants will be far better off going to the SRF program, especially smaller applicants. I think that, and depending on the scarcity of SRF capacity in some states, WIFIA could be very important to help feed excessive demand. In other states, there may not be much need at all for WIFIA if the SRF has sufficient capacity. But we also think that in some cases, larger projects that might take down a lot of debt will be able to access the WIFIA program, thereby freeing up the SRF's capacity, if it is constrained in that particular state, to make loans to smaller projects that otherwise would not be able to get SRF funding. So clearly there is the anticipation that we will work closely, cooperatively with the SRF programs across the nation, but perhaps not play exactly the same role in each state, depending on how much capacity the SRF in that state has.
Are there dedicated staff within the EPA regional offices that will serve as points of contact or technical resources that can be consulted during the application process?
So the quick answer is no. So the WIFIA program is run solely out of EPA headquarters. We do not have regional contacts. We do not have a contact in each region for the WIFIA program. So any kind of assistance that you would need on the application process would come through the headquarters WIFIA program. And similarly, we do not have, it's not like a pot of money or a certain amount of money is intended for each region. So but that said, just because you don't have someone in your regional office, I know often for other programs, you go to the region first. For WIFIA, we welcome people to reach out to the headquarters office and ask us questions directly.
Go ahead, Sam.
Can EPA project how much funding will be available in the first NOFA, and will there be a cap on funding amount for individual projects?
So as we've mentioned, we're still awaiting appropriation. We think it's going to be very soon. We hope it's going to be very soon. So that makes it a little bit difficult for us to predict anything about how much money will be available. We won't really know until we see our appropriation, and we've seen numbers that are very broad, sort of in range, so it would really depend on how much money we get. But to the second question, there is no cap. There is no cap on the project size. So there's a bottom amount. So projects, the eligible total project cost, the total project cost needs to be 20 million. That's the low end for most communities, and then for small communities, it's 5 million. But in terms of how much we can give at the top end, there is no cap.
And for those small communities, can they be part of a larger city?
Yeah, so a small, it's based on your system size. So it's the population served by the system. So you can't say, for example, here in Washington, D.C., we're only servicing this really tiny neighborhood, so it's a small community. The service size of our system here in Washington is well above the 25,000 limit. So it's really based on the system size.
Sam, you don't think that question was related to borrowers banding together in a pool, do you? Okay, just wanted to make sure.
What are the metrics for the O&M plan?
So for the O&M plan, we're looking for a couple of things. We're looking to make sure that you're going to have enough financing to fund your operation, to fund adequate operations and maintenance for the project that we're constructing for the life of the project, the expected service life. And two, we're going to evaluate the operations and maintenance plan to make sure that it is adequate to maintain the service life. So that'll be part of our preliminary evaluation, and we'll do a detailed due diligence of it during the application phase as well.
Can we reiterate the SRF notification talking about the letter of interest versus the application?
Yes. So the notification requirement for the SRF program is based on the statute, the WIFIA statute. So in that statute, Congress mandated EPA to notify the SRF program when we receive an application. As I've mentioned, our process is structured into two phases. There's a letter of interest and there's an application. We felt like notifying the SRF at the time of application was probably too late. It would probably delay the process quite a bit. So even though that's the requirement in the statute, we're actually going to do the notification earlier, and it could be quite a bit earlier. And we think that'll help us, it'll help the SRF programs, it'll help the prospective borrowers figure out what the best funding method is for them. So when we receive a letter of interest, we will review it. If it is an SRF eligible project, then we will take that letter of interest and all the supporting materials and provide it to the appropriate state SRF, so the drinking water or clean water SRF in the state of the applicant, or of the prospective borrower. So we will provide all that information. In the letter of interest, you have the option to opt out of providing all of that information. In that case, we would still notify the appropriate state SRF of the letter of interest, and we would just do some sort of summary document to do that.
We're starting to near the end of our questions, but we have a few more. Who will be approving the engineering reports? Also, who will be making the environmental determination for the projects?
So we're not, at the letter of interest phase, we're not approving an engineering report. We're looking at it to make sure that the project is technically feasible, but us going forward with the proposed project doesn't mean that we're approving the engineering report. It's for a review process so we can see that the project's technically feasible. What was the second part of the question? Oh, the environmental decision. Again, we're not making a decision on your environmental review process at the letter of interest phase. We're looking at your plan and what kind of environmental reviews will need to happen. For example, NEPA or state, to see how that could affect your project schedule and how that would align with WIFIA funding and timelines.
To clarify, US EPA will be administering the NEPA process for this program. Would an alternative project method such as P3 or design, build, operate, maintain be eligible?
Yes. So the eligible entity list is quite lengthy, and it includes private entities as well as municipalities, tribes, joint ventures, SRF programs. So I think pretty much any kind of entity can apply.
Okay, and finally, we've received some questions regarding the determination of creditworthiness and the application submission, but I believe those are going to be addressed in our next session, which will be on Monday from 1 to 3.
Okay, well that concludes the list of questions that we received, so we will wrap up our Q&A session. Karen or Danusha, is there anything else that we should say before we wrap up today's webinar?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate how to reach out to us. So the WIFIA website is www.epa.gov/WIFIA. And while we were here together today, the rules have been posted as well as a blog post kind of explaining the WIFIA program and some of other EPA's other infrastructure financing programs from our current assistant administrator. We also have our EPA email address, wifia@epa.gov, if you have any questions for the WIFIA program staff. And we encourage you to stay up to date by signing up for our kind of our service for announcements. You can sign up there, and that's how we let people know what's going on in the program. And then again, we invite you to join us next week. We have one more webinar in this series on Monday, and same time, 1 o'clock, 1 o'clock Eastern Time, Monday afternoon, and we will be talking about program approval and closing. So I think that's all. So thank you all for joining us again this afternoon. I promise we will get those slides up on the website this week, and we look forward to talking to you again next week.
Okay, bye-bye.